Talent is something that I respect. A talent is always classic. The eternity is in the talent's hands, but the talent has a bad time nowadays. The reason for this lies here, but also a hopeful future. In 2019, an international Kant Congress will take place in Oslo. One of the founders, Viggo Røsberg, said in an interview in 2002 that Immanuel Kant changed our way of thinking. This is an understatement. He has not just changed our thinking, but the way we live and the way we work. His book Critique of Judgment from 1790 defined what would become the rules of art, or fine art, a term that was actually coined in the 18th century. To put it short, Kantian aesthetic philosophy emphasizes purity. A children's drawing, for example, is always art. It is a spontaneous expression. Kant will call it synthetic a priori, a pre-born talent untainted by empirical knowledge. Artists are so often very silent and depressed, and it makes you wonder why. The reason is obvious. These people are grown-ups making children's drawing because they are forced to do it. Living in a world where all effort to improve oneself is futile. This is true for architecture as well. In the 19th century, prisons were sober, simplified buildings. There were no ornaments there to cheer up the convicts. The houses looked like shoeboxes with a lot of holes. Looking at today's architecture, we can see that the residential buildings look just like old prisons, undecorated and without the joy of poetry. Today we are all prisoners. The idea of stripping houses of decorations was already in fashion in 1920s. The new style was supposedly more true. What escaped their mind, however, was that ornaments create harmony amongst men. It is possible that happy pills have replaced the function that our beautiful cities once had. A similar development can be found in painting. In his period, Ernest Meissonier was one of the highest priced painters in France. His Napoleon painting was a favorite at the saloon in Paris. 100 years later, this picture on the right is the highest priced painting from a recently dead artist at the auction houses. One looks like a children's drawing, the other looks like it has been made by a responsible grandfather. So, who or what brought this change about? The ideas that came to define the Western world in the 20th century were developed at the universities in Prussia by Immanuel Kant and his followers. They defined what would be known as Germanism, a cultural idea that was so cleverly changed to modernism after the First World War. In his Critique of Judgment from 1790, Kant writes, "Genius is the opposite of imitation. The genius fumbles to something no one has seen before. The work shall be judged by whim, not craft." By this standard, a genius can produce neither good nor bad work. It is exactly this kind of system, where objective criteria is non-existent, that attracts people who lack a thread of any remarkable talent. Kant emphasizes this view when he says that a painter who strives to make a good work is just a simple handcraftsman with no value compared to a genius. Compliment to the lazy guy, compliment to the genius. A prolific artist of the 20th century once quoted Kant in this way: "I do not paint nature, I am nature." Kant's aesthetic philosophy of perception and aesthetics led to the foundation of so-called German idealism. This introverted movement sought to establish a new form of religious philosophy in contrast to the empiric thinkers. Hegel, in spirit Kant's most significant student, followed up with perhaps the most important addition: spirit of time, zeitgeist. In his introduction to aesthetics, he says that a work which does not adhere to the ideas of its time has no value. The spirit of the work is more important than its craft. No matter how ugly art is, it has more value than nature because it consists of spirit, a spirit from the current time. Hegel's aesthetics has had noticeable influence on art in recent history. The pop artists show an obsession with the context of their time, and artists today can hire craftsmen to do their work for them. The artist does not even have to touch the work. The spirit lives regardless. Among Kant's other followers, we also have Marx. He is a late and peculiar figure, but he had two important contributions: that all works of art have a social function, that good art celebrates good political tendencies. Is this what Kant had in mind? His aesthetic philosophy has supposedly liberated art. Everything is allowed, all but the crafted, sincere expression, the melancholic face. This self-portrait was sold for 3 million British pounds at Christie's in 2017. That would never have occurred before Kant's ideas were established. The sloppy handcraft would have been too obvious. Today, on the other hand, sloppiness is exactly what makes it art. It is an old-fashioned portrait, but the poor execution makes it art. The flaws elevate it into modernism. One could say that total abstraction in painting was the ultimate peak for the Kantian system. The signature was embedded in the brushstrokes. After a while, the Hegelian and Marxist system took over, and the ironic face was put on a pedestal. In 1914, as the Germanism was on the rise, the composer Arnold Schoenberg wrote a letter to Alma Mahler expressing his excitement over the outbreak of the war. Now comes the reckoning. Now we will throw these mediocre kitsch mongers, besaid Stravinsky and Ravel, into slavery and teach them to venerate the German spirit and to worship the German God. Around this time, Van Gogh's work was celebrated as the revolution against classicism, the so-called German freedom of expression. In the post-war period, the beautiful melancholic face vanished completely, as it was predicted by Jose Ortega y Gasset. Painting developed into a C-class category in society. But people cannot live in a world without faces, so when the face returned, it came back with an ironic smile. The face could not return with a heartfelt expression, because that would be synonymous with taking a step backwards. Cinema, however, capitalizes on the heartfelt expression, a criteria not allowed in painting. Cinema did not exist back in Immanuel Kant's day. The filmmaker has therefore escaped his hammer. Consequently, the movie industry has become the leading entertainment business in the world, with its old-fashioned ideas about drama and sentimentality. The filmmaker has always focused on the human face. That is why movies enjoy the spotlight in our time. Apart from movies, crime novels and cookbooks have also escaped Kant's critique of judgment. 100 years of Kantian idealism in retrospect. What have we won and what have we lost? We have won freedom from craft, freedom from responsibility, freedom from sincerity. We have lost the human face, the mythological story, the magic of recognition. Since we know how the modernist ideas came about, the question then becomes, who gives the green light? Who is the judiciary? Immanuel Kant and his critique of judgment, as I mentioned earlier, is the legislative power, the rule book, the Bible, so to speak. Followingly, the judicial power belongs to people with degrees in art history, better known as the art police. And the executive power has and will always be the government or the officials and the rich investors. They follow advice from art consultants with a degree in art history. Most philosophers in the 20th century engaging in aesthetic have been Kant followers, including Adorno, who mocked both Tchaikovsky and Sibelius for being kitsch, and Greenberg, who claimed that anything but avant-garde was just for the subhumans. Immanuel Kant's witch doctors, the first generation of art police, is Ortega y Gasset, Herbert Reed, Walter Benjamin, Wittgenstein, Adorno, Heidegger, Harald Rosenberg, Clement Greenberg, Danto, Hermann Brock, André Malraux, Marcuse, and many more. A few art historians, however, have opposed the doctrine of Kant. In choosing differently, favoring a classical talent instead of the artist, they have been frozen out and have had to take low-status positions in the provinces. After 1907, everything suddenly changed, probably because of the big Cézanne exhibition in Paris and the German philosophy, of course. After that, more and more art historians began to follow the German theories. The art should change the world to a better place, to be a political aesthetic system about humanity, about the clichés, the religious and the Hellenistic image, and the art should make its own rules apart from the old Western culture. And artists should be themselves and have their own voice. To draw in a clear classical way had been declared as phony. After the Second World War, the critic, the art historian, had taken the artist's place. They are now themselves artists, and the artists are just a potato in their kitchen. Is there any alternative to the present situation? A philosophical alternative? Despite how strange it may sound, we have been in this situation before. When the Renaissance blossomed in the 15th century, ideas from antiquity had replaced a 1,000 years period of dogmatic Christendom. The times of witch hunt and anti-human values were finally over. "200 years before, in his Summa Theologica, Thomas Aquinas had put forth the claim that religious mysticism should not be exercised when it appears to be in conflict with reason. What had inspired such thoughts? Aristotle and his conviction that our judgment of the world must be decided through our senses and not through religious dogmas. The Renaissance broke away from the linear understanding of history. The idea of Christ's return disappeared and the love of earthly life resurrected. But most important of all, ancient thinker Aristotle and his ideas about virtue put an end to the medieval time. Gradually, buildings and sculptures came to be constructed in a manner that pleased the viewer's eyes. The peak of classical revival in Europe took place in the mid-16th century in Italy, when Aristotle's philosophical writings on poetry became one of the main topics of discussion. The essential message in Aristotle's Poetic is the acknowledgement that painters, sculptors, and writers all engage in mimesis. For this reason, they should say as little as possible in their own voice and take use of the techniques that have been handled down through generations or otherwise acquired through empiric studies. The premise for poetry in Aristotle's view is that it is concerned with storytelling. In his Poetics, he includes 3 different possible forms and the level of difficulty that corresponds to them. The first level is a drama from your own time, which is usually a comedy. The second level involves an historical drama, which is usually a tragedy. And the third level comes with a story from the underworld of the dead, which is the most difficult. There were no props from any time, just naked bodies and some rags, and that was all. You find Aristotle's in Titian's latest paintings, Dante's Divina Commedia, and of course Michelangelo's Doomsday. In Aristotle's word, being timeless is of utmost important. And we can see that in Michelangelo's masterpiece, to be dead is timeless. The engagement of Aristotle's mimesis is demonstrated by the Renaissance masters shamelessly copying Greek masterpieces in the attempt to improve upon them. And they did improve upon the Greeks, Michelangelo perhaps more than anyone else, since he paved the way for the Baroque epoch. An example of Michelangelo's copying a Greek sculpture is of course the Belvedere Torso, which can be found in the Last Judgment. It was no secret that he admired the ruined sculpture, and its reverence was universal, not only with the late Renaissance painters, but with the Modernists and the Baroque painters as well. In man's achievement to reach the highest possible level of culture and quality, it is not by accident that the source of inspiration for the Renaissance were the ancient Greeks. The difference between the Greeks and their neighboring civilization at the time was that Greek culture emphasizes lifelike representations instead of authoritarian taste. The fountainhead for the Greek mentality came in three forms: logos, identification through realistic, well-proportioned representation of the human figure; pathos, drama, through facial expression and contrapposto; ethos, moral lesson, through elevated storytelling or catharsis in the dramas. This was a common understanding in the Renaissance. From the circular time of the Hellenistic culture, the painting is the project of a great man, but is also the project of great ideas that had developed for centuries, and this should not be taken for granted. Today's world is ruled by different ideas that derived from Prussia, and primarily from the modern German thinker Immanuel Kant. The essence of Kant is that the genius needs no form of knowledge, and neither does the critic. The essence of Aristotle is that everyone can develop true virtue, and that the most qualified critic has tried the craft himself. In a sense, Kant, Hegel, and Marx seem to conflict with the Aristotelian values aesthetically, politically, and ethically. Examples where Aristotle says the exact opposite of Kant: pure colors do not exist, and harmony is achieved through the blending of colors. Devote yourself to imitation of nature and avoid originality, because originality hinders life. The craft is just a means to an end, and the end is to convey universal truth about humanity. The best work is created from interest, not disinterest. It was under this standard the Greeks lived by. The Greeks were learning by competing, and so were the painters and sculptors during the Renaissance. Competition was their language of consensus. It had no importance that a work looked like another work, because it says nothing of its quality. When there is competition, people become interested. The search for answer to become the best is also seen with Titian, whose use of pittura di macchia and a limited palette were derived directly from ancient writings. This dissolving style is something that Titian most likely read about in Pliny's Natural History on the Greek painter Apelles, whom Pliny claimed to be the greatest painter ever lived. When Titian painted this picture, he hoped that it would look like a real Apelles. So you could say that Titian was a pupil of Apelles 2,000 years after him. The painters from the Renaissance never had any sense or care for being yourself or having your own voice. It was only about skill. It was not just Renaissance painters who learned to adopt Apelles techniques. The Swedish painter Anders Zorn, born in 1860 and dead in 1920, used a Apelles palette. And you can see he used two colors and black and white. Even Aristotle talked about colors, and he was sure that the blue was just a blending of black and light. That is the blue achieved with the Apelles palette. The typical Greek in Aristotle's world knew very well that less is more, or use as few colors as possible. In great aversion to this four-color principle, Kant commanded that no color should be blended with another color, a direct opposition to Aristotle, who said that light in color is something you can only get if you blend them together. Therefore, in order to not blend colors, Cézanne painted with 20 to 40 colors on his palette at the very least. It is also typical here that Cézanne makes no sexual desire for his models, an idea Kant wrote about that shames a painter for having interest in their subject. And as we can see with Zorn's sexual interest, he is not acceptable in the German idea of beauty. Later in his life, art historians were discussing if Zorn's painting were real art or not. Despite the conceptual hold on the modern time, Zorn takes a very cheap piece of firewood to make this bust of his grandmother. This is also an example of Apelles using the most natural materials to create the greatest work. There is an interesting realization here. Everything that was painted before Kant, for example Rembrandt, is accepted by the modern art police. But painting like Rembrandt after Kant will therefore create big problems for painters because they have not followed Kant's law of the real art. So you can say that he made a new religion. So in the modern museum, it is almost illegal to exhibit classical realism. This is a policy that has lasted as long as I have lived, and before that also. So this is not something new for young people. You can't enter a museum, a modern museum today, which shows representational paintings, as they are nothing but an example of the bad old time. These concern many things in modern society. For example, you will never be able to get big prizes for your virtuous pictures because no art historians will support the 21st century classicism. In South Africa, during apartheid, there no colored allowed and whites only eras are similar to the modern museum with only white walls and only modernism. Strictly forbidden are those pictures with expression of love in the human faces. Only irony is allowed. We have now had 3 German idealists. It is not by accident that German scientists invented the nuclear bomb, but they have also invented communism, National Socialism, and the art police. Nazism and communism has fallen, but the art police will still continue unbroken. This is an example of how much power the art police has been given. They advise all the institutions in society about visual culture. What is it that the art police want to achieve? Well, if they should set the standard for investment consultation in all master painting at the Getty Museum, then they have to follow the rules of the classical European standard. Well, I'm now talking about the actual values that the art police have when judging contemporary art. Then they want the new. The new is the pinnacle in the modern tradition. Good and bad do not exist. The art police are seeking the new in vulgarity. They believe the Holy Grail is there. Pop music is also a part of this. In the hunt for the new, it seems that art is slowly fading away. The philosopher George Friedrich Hegel had a dream that art would one day be unnecessary, and that mankind would live together as walking pieces of art, which is the golden end of Hegel's linear world. Give Aristotle the same position as the German philosophers, we need direct action to make sure that 50% of the art institution are Aristotelian thinkers. Hegelian understanding of history is linear. Aristotle's understanding of time is circular, timeless, just like the sun. This must end. The modernist policy has lasted for so many years now, and it is unacceptable. Many young and very talented painters have had horrible problems with the art police. One suggestion would be, in the university studies, after half a year, there should be a divorce between the Aristotelian and the Kantian education, so the students can choose which direction they want to pursue, just as we divorce the hospital between the surgeon and the medical doctor dealing with epidemic. With other words, the art history faculty at the universities must change and let another voice speak, so that the study does not become an eternal monologue where other people's opinions are non-existent. So many talents are ignored by the present Western society, and they are waiting to be noticed. To repeat the important Aristotle's in painting, the creative person is rejoiced by their imitation of nature, and the audience is rejoiced through its identification. And now I will show you some of my pupils' work. There is nothing wrong with the talents of this time. There are impressive talents all over the world, especially in America and China. They sometimes make fantastic masterpieces that we can only get samples of from the internet. And I have to say that I am so proud of the new classical wave in America. Some of them have mastered composition as did the great masters from the old time. Students that are lost to modernism. This is a student of mine who was immensely talented. Because of the pressure, however, he has now bent his head for modernism. Kant's thinking was an attempt to eliminate the Western culture, and this demolition was in great dependence of Aristotle's thinking, meaning it was an antithesis to Aristotle. We have to bring Aristotle back again to the universities so there will be a dialogue and a change from a monologue to dialogue, from war to peace, simply civilized education. In my view, Kant has borrowed plenty from the Psalms of Hans Adolf Brorson as well as the Bible. He grew up in a pietistic environment, and it is reflected in his writings. The story about the Tower of Babel from Genesis gives us a clue to what Kant's critique of judgment is actually about. Men spoke the same tongue, and everyone lived together in harmony. Life was uncomplicated because good and evil were understandable concepts. When they were building the tower, they had the same language all over the world, and they all understood each other. Together, they were building in an attempt to reach the sky. God did not approve. This was not how the promised land was to be built. He cast a curse on them so that no one understood each other. Everyone spoke with their own private tongue. Thus it all fell apart as communication was lost, and the tower ended as a pile of rubble, destroyed by the madness that had occurred. And so it is with Kant. He has systematically broke down the common language, introduced a feeling of emptiness into our minds, and orchestrated complete cultural Armageddon. We now live in Kant's fulfilled wasteland, but we are all longing for a civilized language.